Hey, Inspired Moneymaker. In this episode, we're talking about everything from managing risk in filmmaking to creating NFTs for Mike Tyson. Episode 232 features Sophie Watts, global media executive, investor, dealmaker.
We've done multiple drops, including a Mike Tyson or a series of Mike Tyson drops, which have generated over $20 million in trading volume around his voice. And what the artist has realized is, this is a tool for me to reach my audiences, to build accretive value for my fan base, and frankly, to unlock, to use that NFT as an ability to unlock broader entertainment experiences and utilities, whether it's trading or gaming or physical experiences, live experiences. And I think the opportunity in that space is wildly, wildly big.
I'm Andy Wong, host of the Inspired Money podcast and financial advisor at Runnymede Capital Management. This episode is brought to you by Seeking Alpha. Seeking Alpha Premium is a subscription service that gets you everything you need to make smarter investing decisions. Whether you have a portfolio of stocks, ETFs, or mutual funds, Seeking Alpha Premium gives you expert market analysis, proprietary quant ratings, unlimited call transcripts and earnings calls, powerful stock screeners, and more. It's quick and easy to link your brokerage account. With Seeking Alpha Quant ratings, author ratings, and Wall Street ratings, you'll immediately get a snapshot that tells you which stocks in your portfolio rank well, or those that might require attention. Join over 200,000 subscribers today. I have a special for you too. Use the link inspiredmoney.fm/alpha for a 14-day trial. You'll get 50% off by buying the annual plan. It's $179.99, which works out to less than $15 a month. Now, let's get on to the show. Our guest is Sophie Watts. She's co-owner of Mike Tyson's Legends Only League, and together with Kiki Tyson, architected the big event that was Mike Tyson's first boxing match in 15 years. It featured 6 boxing matches, 6 musical artists, and was broadcast around the globe. Sophie was the founding president of STX Entertainment, where she built a fully-fledged movie studio involved with movies including The Foreigner with Jackie Chan, Bad Mom starring Mila Kunis, and Molly's Game by Academy Award-winning writer-director Aaron Sorkin. Today, she's founder and executive chairperson at Metacurio, a creative studio that leads global brands, A-list talent, and cultural creators on their journey into the future of Web3, fandom, and engagement. In this episode, you'll learn how STX grew from a startup into a multi-billion-dollar media company, successfully fundraising to finance film projects from investors from the US to Asia. And tune into the end to hear why Sophie is keen on NFTs going mainstream and how blockchain can realign how artists are protected and paid. Now let's get inspired with Sophie Watts. Sophie, welcome to Inspired Money. I'm so excited to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I've been a big follower and listener for a long time, so glad to be on.
Let's jump right in. What's your earliest childhood memory of money?
Look, it's funny because, and I don't know if this is a cultural thing. I live in Los Angeles now and have done for about 15 years. But when I grew up in London, there was very little talk about money, about having money, about not having money. But I received a single pound weekly that I would spend on sweets and candy at the local store, much to my parents' frustration, I'm sure. But that was my introduction to a budget and spending, and that £4 a month went a long way to a lot of sugar. But definitely helped kind of instill that notion of money, what it can get you, how to earn it, and that was something my parents were quite strict about.
It's good to meet a fellow sweet tooth. Well, you have to enjoy life a little bit.
So sometimes too much, sadly, Andy.
Well, I'm very excited to have you on the show. Your professional trajectory and experience in growing businesses are very impressive. Let's start with STX Entertainment because I want to hear from you. What was it like going from a two-person startup to a 140 plus employee, multi-billion dollar movie studio?
Well, certainly was a ride for 7 or 8 years that I was there. It's SDX was actually born out of past experience that I'd had in the music industry. I'd grown up with a very entrepreneurial mother. She had been at Virgin Records with Branson for many years, almost 20 years, and I'm sure by that relationship, I had fallen into the music industry at a very young age. Firstly, as a PA, as a runner, and built my way up through the ranks back in London. And I really witnessed the streaming revolution with these artists that I was working with, and watched as Napster and iTunes and these emerging technologies frankly caught the music industry completely flat-footed. And I looked at that and said, well, it stands to reason that if these gigantic stars that I'm working with, the Madonnas and Beyoncés of the world, are losing out by the advent of new technology, firstly, what a crazy business structure that the star is the person being disintermediated. But secondly, that struck me as an interesting inflection point in media in general. And I thought, look, if this is happening in music, it stands to reason that it will happen in the traditional movie industry. And someone should build a movie studio with and around almost a traditional movie star, the stars that I grew up with, who had a direct relationship with their audiences. So I packed my suitcases. I was in my early 20s. I was 18 years old. So I was extremely fortunate to be able to ride that wave. And it was very interesting watching, and without going into too much detail about STX's infrastructure, but a key part of our investors were that they were global investors who really saw that these movie stars could speak and translate to audiences all over the world. So we accrued capital from mainland China, had partnerships with Tencent and PCCW in China and in Hong Kong, and then spread to much more institutional investors like Liberty Global. So it was definitely a critical moment in my life, almost a decade of really experiencing how to grow teams and evolve with teams. And certainly a moment in saying, have we built this correctly? If we were doing this again, what would we do differently? And when I departed the studio, I certainly think that I took those financial lessons with me, and evolved them in a way that's proved to be very helpful.
I heard you once say that it's not really about the money. It's about how you get the smartest and most strategic money around the table. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, Honey Capital, which was one of the early investors in SDX, it's led by a very prolific investor called John Zhao in mainland China. And the theory for me was, despite the weekend trips that I would make to Beijing, truly every Saturday night for about 7 years, I would fly from LA to Beijing to sit with my investors and partners there. But it struck me as apparent that, candidly, John would know the environment and the economy and the market far better than I would ever understand. And if we were going to get movies distributed in mainland China, we needed people who understood the landscape, who on a daily basis interacted with people in the landscape. And that was a real example of an investor who grew with the company, who provided almost invaluable strategic advice to markets that I will never understand to the depth and richness that he does and will continue to do. I am an absolute believer, not in a flippant way, that a dollar is not a dollar, but that if that dollar can come with it wise and sage experience, that it's a dollar that can help make the company grow exponentially, as opposed to coming in and going out. And I've had the tremendous fortune of working with really savvy, really forward-thinking investors in that sense.
You had tremendous success in raising money from investors both in the US and overseas. How is seeking investment in the US versus going to Asia? How is that different?
It's such a fantastic question. There was a moment that you may remember about 10 years ago, 8 years ago, when traditional Silicon Valley really started looking at the media space and saying, how do we get into entertainment? We're behemoths. And the interesting part for me is that I found that Northern Southern California cultural divide so much harder to overcome than the Hollywood cultural bridge with China, purely because we had the same goals, the same meaning of what we believed to be the star, which was the Will Smiths or Tom Cruises or Julia Robertses of the world. And I found that a fairly thrilling learning curve, mostly actually to do with how transactions carried out. You know, we're used to, in a very Western sense, here's the yes, here's the no, do you want it? Yes, or do you want it? No. And there was a curve in realizing that it could be a really interesting opportunity, rather than being so black and white, to actually learn those approaches to negotiation, which I discovered in China were much more about, here are some options. Do you like any of these options? Not for a yes or no answer, but for an excitement in the concept. And once you've chosen the idea you like the most, that's when you kind of hone the direction you're going with the deal. I do feel that that cultural gap was widely overcome with that approach, and that served us very well for many, many years. To me, I'm not a black and white negotiator. I'm a real believer that if you have an honest conversation and you find what your goal is that's communicative, you can always find your way to the path and to the right money and to the money that will support the direction you're going in. Some of the best deals I have made have been the worst on paper, but the right emotional fit. And I've certainly done some deals that were fantastic cash deals, but turned out to be really complicated, practical implementations of those partnerships and that money.
Given that you have experience now, do you feel like you can get an earlier gut feeling sooner, or is it always a matter of waiting to see how it plays out ultimately?
No, it's really, David Bonderman at TPG sat on the board of STX, and he once said to me, if you can't do the deal on the back of a napkin, the deal's too complicated. You have to understand what the deal's about. You can figure out all of the fine print and the small print, but you really need a back of napkin of, are we on the same page? And I took that advice very seriously, and I continued to take that seriously. I think, including in employing people and empowering people, people spend an awful lot of time planning once someone's part of the company, and once you've taken the money, and once you've solidified that deal, and very little time actually talking with one another to find, do we like one another? Do we want to spend time working with one another? Every deal, and I'm sure you've encountered this, every deal at some point goes wrong. And it's 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning, and you're bleary-eyed walking down the corridor. You want to run into people in that moment of crisis that you always overcome and find a solution to. But you want to run into people that you like, who have the same values and the same moral code and the same compass of what you're doing. And that has been guidance from Bonderman and from that gut feeling that I really focus on at this point very deeply: who you're working with, how you're working with them, and do you want to be together in this?
Producing a film, I think, like a film project, can be viewed as quite risky. Any advice, or how is it that you can clearly communicate your project to prospective investors?
What a brilliant question, because the film industry is obviously notoriously very, very difficult to structure and finance. Look, STX and I'd funded some independent movies and raised some money for a few independent documentaries before the studio kicked off. And I obviously had experience in my prior time in music and music film. I'd produced several hundred live music film shows, so I certainly knew how to balance a budget. Candidly, as a child, I'd never had the money available to not watch every cent or any dollar, or any spend was fairly rigorously watched over. And that certainly continued through my producing career. But the first question that struck me when STX started as a studio, for those who don't know, STX was started as a concept of, rather than the traditional Hollywood thesis of making a movie, developing a movie, spending millions of dollars, getting the perfect script, and then going to your actors or your director and saying, do you want to appear in this? It struck me as such a terrible waste to not just first ask the talent, who are the reason you're making the movie, do you want to play an astronaut? Do you want to play a doctor? And if you don't, I'm probably not going to spend $2 or $3 million developing a script. So the idea was a very clean and simple idea of, let's start with the piece of talent that will get this movie made and can market directly to an audience. And what independent producers, certainly when I was entering this industry, don't focus much on is, it's less just about raising the money to make your piece of art than realizing, if money is going out, how is the money coming back to you? And that is, in Hollywood, the difference between being a production company that makes and can often finance movies and a studio. A studio not only makes the movie, but is able to market and distribute, whether it's on streaming and sold to HBO Max, or it's in a movie theater. There's a way where the money that's going out can come back in. So what STX did as almost a hack to the financial system of movies was to actually structure guaranteed distribution agreements with all of the major theater chains. Different agreements with different movie theaters that meant we knew, if we were making a movie, whether that movie was wonderful or not, and obviously the hope is always that you're making a wonderful movie, but at least we knew that once the movie was made, at least 2,500 movie theater screens in North America would be playing that movie. And that really, for the TPGs and Liberty Globals and PCCWs of the world, these are very sophisticated investors. They started saying, well, we know if the money's going in, how potentially it can come back to the company. And then we put a series of financing structures to help mitigate the risk. We had film finance slate partners. We had a syndicate of banks with debt. We had tax credits. So for a studio that spent close to $1 billion a year making, marketing, and distributing this content, the average equity check for a movie, which often is about $50 million, was about $500,000 to actually make the movie. It was a deeply efficient financing structure. And traditional Hollywood doesn't approach financing in that sense. It is very much judged on art for art's sake and the beauty of a movie and the script being correct. And that was not the thesis of STX. Now, that came to an interesting inflection point when social media emerged. And for me, I started to realize maybe movie theaters aren't as aggressively the future of movies as they were when the studio was started. How do we realign the way that these artists are compensated? Does it make sense to make these movies anymore, or should we be building companies around talent to capture the venture growth of these voices, of these A-list stars who for the first time ever have a direct relationship with their audiences? And I think that was a seismic shift in media, and something that I actually departed STX to follow up with and hone in on.
So I like the idea of starting with the talent and then reverse engineering. Like, what role is it that the talent wants to play? So is it safe to assume that an actor who has no social media accounts would be viewed as less attractive as somebody who has a Twitter account with, tens of millions of followers?
It's a perfect example for why. So I produced a Mike Tyson comeback exhibition fight about a year and a half ago at the end of 2020. And, I really looked at the landscape from a data perspective. I looked at Tyson's social media followings and could literally and functionally analyze who is his audience, who would tune in for this exhibition. And you realize quite quickly it's boxing fanatics, it's people who grew up with a Mike Tyson, it's the kids whose parents, talk about Tyson who are boxing fans. But then I said, how do you broaden the audience of this show? How do I get not just a boxing fanatic, but a teenager or a social media savant or an influencer a Gen Z or a millennial who will tune into a show, who won't necessarily be buying for $50 a pay-per-view exhibition for Mike Tyson? The decision to cast and hire as a boxer Jake Paul, who is as I'm sure you know, rampant social media star,
YouTuber
turned professional boxer, YouTuber, exactly. That decision was purely based on his extraordinary reach on socials. I knew it was a different audience that we would reach, and we could track analytically, once we booked him to fight in that show, we could track the audience and how all of a sudden we'd gone from quite a specific vertical of viewers to a much broader, much younger audience tuning in for him. I then looked at that and said, well, that's a very male-dominated audience. How do we bring in women who probably are willing to spend the money for a fun, entertaining night? And I looked at and analyzed, well, women probably want some old school music. What would that look like? And I analyzed the socials, and it came back that Snoop Dogg would be a perfect performer and a perfect artist and a perfect commentator to provide comic relief and to provide fun music that women would, in a certain demographic, would connect to. I booked Snoop Dogg as a result. So it's a kind of entertaining example of a show that ended up having about 22 pieces of very different talent, from Tyson to professional boxers, Jake Paul to Snoop Dogg to Wiz Khalifa to Mario Lopez hosting it. And it broke all pay-per-view records for 2020. So I am to your question of, does it matter? I think demonstrably, it was a game changer for that live show, and created a new category of sports entertainment that would have been close to impossible for me to book 20 years ago when I first started in the music industry. It would have been impossible to know those statistics and numbers.
Well, it's interesting to hear how you can take advantage of social media to assist in the planning, conceptualization, and then execution of such a big project. How is it that you initially got connected with Mike and Kiki Tyson to start with?
It was actually, I had gone to, at the time, I was spending a lot of time with a very well-known rapper and hip-hop artist, and I was at one of his kids' birthday parties, and I ran into a producer, and he said, I know Mike Tyson, and he's looking to have a female media executive on his podcast. Would you be connected with him? Would that be okay if I connected you? And frankly, I had left STX. I was incubating talent-driven ventures, almost like a Y Combinator for A-list talent, an ecosystem around these voices. And I thought it would be a fun conversation to call home to my family and said, I'd been on a podcast with Mike Tyson. And on that podcast, he said, kind of fascinatingly, and I always am stunned by the awareness of audience that these gigantic icons have. He said, look, there's a missing gap between sports and entertainment. I'm not a traditional boxer anymore. I don't fit into a sports vertical. I'm in my 50s. I also know I have a huge fan base who won't necessarily show up to see me in a movie. But what's the midway? I know it's something to do with sports, and I know it's something to do with entertainment, but what could that be? And I said, well, that sounds an awful lot like a sports league that's entertaining, that's fun, almost Super Bowl-esque halftime shows with sports filtered into it. Why don't we build that company? I will co-build that company for you, build the operations and the day-to-day management, and we'll build an ecosystem around your voice. That is very true to my history of how do you support the artist, empower their voice, and strategically use resources, which is often money. How do you use that money to empower and realign the way the artist is incentivized to be paid not just in a one-time check, but in actual ownership of a venture? So it was a really interesting experience for me, watching that company grow, and obviously having wild success with that live event, which also included a premium content angle. It also included a consumer product angle. And then, of course, as that company was being built, this new technology, this new apparent game changer of NFTs emerged into a much more mainstream landscape. And the Tysons of the world and the other stars I was dealing with started to call and say, Sophie, you've spent an awful lot of time working with us to build and realign the way that we could be supported. Can you explain this world to us? And that is now what I spend a vast amount of my time doing, is living and breathing in a blockchain and Web3 landscape, which I truly believe can re-incentivize and realign the way these artists are protected and paid.
Before we go there, as a creative yourself, when you're going through this creative process of putting together an event, like a boxing, music event, to what extent are you creating? And then how do you fit in, how can we monetize, the different aspects of this project?
I will tell you of the many shows that I have been part of. This was at the height of the pandemic. It was more pieces of talent than are booked for the Super Bowl. It was live broadcast across the world. And for the first time ever, this show encompassed boxing promoters, event promoters, live broadcast producers, distribution partners, and then, of course, you're sanctioned by an athletic commission that is making sure that everyone is safe. So it was a deeply complex show to put together. I will say very honestly, I didn't know how successful the show would be. I knew we had raised the money to put the show together. It wasn't until about 2 weeks before the event that I started looking at the tracking board for the reception and started to see the close to billion media impressions that Tyson was receiving from his social media videos and from his documentary, that I started to understand the pay-per-view model could be wildly successful in this. But true to my structure of STX, everything I build is designed to mitigate the financial risk for all players involved. So in this instance, I sold the rights to the event and captured the upside. But part of that negotiation was ensuring that Tyson would be protected up front as a guarantee, so that he would be protected for the time he put into doing it together. But that, to your earlier question, how do you make money from movies? How do you put these things together? It's the great debate about art. You better love what you're doing, because it's a speculative business. You have to structure deals in the most efficient, effective, protective way possible. Now, obviously, now we've proven a point. There is a much easier case study to point to be riskier in choices, but I will never put investors in that situation.
So it sounds like there were moments, given the scope of this project, you did have some scary moments of unknown.
There was absolutely a moment on Thanksgiving Day, which was 2 days before the live show on Saturday night, where I genuinely thought, wow, this event could fall apart. And that was a moment of 2 o'clock, walking down the corridor in the office going, my goodness, you better have partners that you want to be working with. And ultimately, we overcome that. I'm extremely fortunate that we had fantastic producers on board. But there was a real unknown entity in this, which was a global pandemic. And for a live show, the only live show to be sanctioned in Los Angeles in 2020.
With a limited audience, right? With a limited live audience.
In fact, no live audience. It was entirely broadcast globally with no ticketing and no audience. So that was a true roll up your sleeves. You need to learn on the fly. These protocols have never been put in place before because we have never lived through this before. How do we keep everyone safe? And as a producer, and in this instance, I had two hats on, not only as an owner of the business and an operator of the business, but as a physical producer of this event. Your number one priority is keeping people safe and keeping people away from any harm. So we were deeply vigilant about that. And that is what you have to do.
Once you pulled it off, how did it feel?
It felt like I needed 3 days of sleep, which I proceeded to have. Look, it's I like building things. I'm a builder. I'm a scrappy builder. I'm a big believer that you've got to love what you're doing. It is in fact, Richard Branson quote that he has said often, which is, if you love what you do, you're probably good at it. And if you're good at it, you're probably going to make a lot of money from doing it. So make sure you love what you do. And the culmination of that show was pride at the team that it had been pulled off, but a reminder that I love what I do, and I'm very fortunate to have the opportunity to do that.
As a side note, is it true that your mom had some input in the name Virgin?
My mother, and this story is not frequently told. The answer is yes. But my mother left home when she was very young, when she was about 16, from the British countryside. She'd had quite a traditional upbringing. She loved rock and roll and music, and it was the 60s, early 70s, and she moved to London, where she set up a market stall, a Portobello market, which is almost like a flea market, quite notorious now in London. And she would sell records. And her friend, her best friend, and her buddy in selling these records was a woman called Joan. And every weekend, while they were selling records, someone called Richard would come to the stall and say, you've got great music taste, and I kind of like this woman, Joan, Tessa, which was my mother's name. Tessa, can you introduce me to Joan? And many decades later, Mrs. Joan Branson remains married to Richard. And my mother left that market stall to go and work at the very, very early days of a record label that she helped name Virgin, which was on a houseboat in London. So certainly had a model of an entrepreneurial parental figure who believed in chasing what you love.
Important lessons. You guys are just too cool. I want to hang out with you to attend rappers, kids' birthday parties. And if I could go back in time, spend time with your mom, because it sounds like she must have had many, many cool adventures as well. So let's talk a little bit about what is the opportunity that you see with the A-list talent in Web3?
Well, it was an interesting moment for me about a year ago when talent such as Tyson started hearing these rumors that someone named something called Beeple as some kind of $69 million something. Why aren't we part of that? And the more I dug in, the more I started to learn, the more I started to see an opportunity where an STX, a media studio of the future, could be built in a way in which all of the mechanisms that I've traditionally worked with that help pass about how artists are paid could be automated, could be built in a way in which the artist would immutably be protected, in which the creator would always have a say and would always be empowered. And I think as a base note of a studio of the future, that automatically became something of deep interest to me. So I called a friend of mine who had deep experience in blockchain, was a global lecturer on blockchain, had invested in Bitcoin very early on, called Jeff Hood. I said to Jeff, I feel like there's an opportunity here. I've got dozens of pieces of big name talent who individually have, if not billion-dollar name brands, hundreds of millions of dollars of value built around their name. Would there be a way for us to build a studio that is not a platform, that is not a marketplace, that is not a software or a technology play, and simultaneously is not a traditional talent agency that don't live and breathe in a decentralized space? You are built to actually transact and take a percentage of that transaction. What if we were to build a studio that sat between the two and partnered with this traditional talent to lead them into a Web3 world? And what that could look like is, how about we handle some NFT drops for these artists, almost as a white glove, plug and play solution. We handle all of the infrastructure. We handle all of the Web3 space, all of the partnerships with the OpenSeas or Ripples or Nifties of the world, and really provide an easy solution for these traditional brands and talent to enter that space. We started that company about a year ago, and to my amazement, have about 65 clients. We've done multiple drops, including a Mike Tyson or a series of Mike Tyson drops, which have generated over $20 million in trading volume around his voice. And what the artist has realized is, oh, this is a tool for me to reach my audiences, to build accretive value for my fan base, and frankly, to unlock, to use that NFT as an ability to unlock broader entertainment experiences and utilities, whether it's trading or gaming or physical experiences, live experiences. And I think the opportunity in that space is wildly big. The ability to scale that and ultimately build into that metaverse, I think, is an unrivaled opportunity. And Mark Zuckerberg is a far smarter guy than I, but clearly that is the future for Meta. And I think a lot of traditional media companies will start to view that space similarly.
This is just off the top of my head, but I remember seeing of your client list, I saw Dennis Rodman on there. I saw Wesley Snipes on there. So when it comes to the NFTs, Metaverse, and crypto, what's the lay of the land right now? And what's the direction that you see this, like, where are we going?
So this is early. And I know the conversation, and a lot of people who talk to me go, oh, well, are NFTs? Tell us about that. Is this a scam? Should we invest in this? This to me is the very tip of the spear. This is very early on in this game. Where are we now? Clearly, there's a trading value, and we've seen the multiples that marketplaces are gaining purely through trading volume. These companies like an OpenSea. There is an opportunity to enter that space, to connect with buyers, fans, enthusiasts. Where's the future? I believe the future is going to be in a metaverse where people who look at a physical experience and the boundaries that a physical world bring on us are completely unrestricted in a metaverse. Right now, transacting on an NFT, selling that NFT, even collecting and earning and trading those NFTs is interesting. I clearly believe there's true value, but that to me is the opening point to a broader world in which, if there's a museum, why wouldn't that museum exist in a metaverse? And why wouldn't I, as an avatar, have the ability to dress the way I want and look the way I want and explore the way I want without the restrictions of a physical reality? NFTs feel like an entree into that space, and a really wise one into that space. But I can't stress enough, this feels like the beginning. So whilst we have, in many respects, a lot of A-list clients, we also have a number of very large corporate brands who are looking at this saying, sure, you went to the Super Bowl this year, but what would the Super Bowl look like if it was in the metaverse? What would it look like if you were in that stadium? What would you be wearing? How would you be interacting? How would you be participating and interacting in that landscape? That to me is the future.
I think it takes a little bit of that creativity and imagination that I'm sure that you experienced in Hollywood to kind of picture the possibilities. I always feel like Hollywood is so good about having a pulse on pop culture and what's happening, and then trying to take a look down the road at where we're going. So many creative people, I think, have that vision.
Have that vision, but the interesting opportunity with Hollywood right now, and this was partly the inception of STX, when you're a behemoth of a machine And at this point in media, there is such mass consolidation. It's very tough to pivot that skyscraper into a different landscape. How do you take a 100-story building and turn it into a sprawling shopping mall? It's incredibly difficult to do. So it feels like the innovators in this space will not come from a traditional media studio, although they may have been trained and honed by the Hollywood creative experience. It will come from people who are not bound to the infrastructure by which you have to play in those traditional structures. And that's a tremendously exciting opportunity for new artists, for new creators, for new innovators in the space. I absolutely believe that Hollywood will follow, but what an amazing time for invention and wide thinking.
Yeah, it's great to see, somebody doesn't need to be a stage theater actor. There are YouTubers and people on Instagram with huge followings. So it's fascinating to watch. Can you talk a little bit about your Ukraine NFT fundraiser?
Yeah, look, that's a really important one for us. One of our clients is Klitschko, the infamous heavyweight champion boxer. His brother is the mayor of Kyiv. Right now, clearly the state of crisis is both horrific and devastating in the same breath. For us, the ability to work with Wisby, who I believe is the fourth most syndicated artist in the NFT space, Wisby will be creating 3 unique NFTs, a play on his Vandal Gummy. There'll be 3 different price points to buy those NFTs, those 3 different NFTs. It's an open edition, so as many people who can purchase an NFT as possible, the better. But for us, it's about doing everything we can to raise money and direct those funds to the Klitschko family, who will be deploying those proceeds. That, for one, felt like an innovative, fast, and hopefully helpful way to support what's going on.
Well, it's good to see you, acting quickly to help those in need. I like to ask all the Inspired Money guests, how do you define success?
I define success as happiness, and I define happiness as wanting what you have. And almost all of my decisions are based on that barometer. Do you have this? Does it make you happy? Are you searching for something else in this deal, in this partner? And if not, that sure sounds like success.
Well, thank you for sharing your journey with us and educating us about Web3 and where things may be going. Can you tell the Inspired Money listeners and viewers where to follow you and find out more?
You can follow our Web3 studio at Metacurio, Metacurio.com, Metacurio.com. And I'm Sophie Watts. I'm happy to connect with you anytime, any place.
Thank you so much, Sophie.
Totally my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Andy.
So what was your favorite Inspired Money moment? I'm super impressed by Sophie's successful career. That and going to rappers' kids' birthday parties. Can you imagine that? My big takeaway is that Sophie spots megatrends. She once worked with musical artists like Beyonce, Elton John, Madonna, and Mariah Carey. Then she moved to Hollywood. STX raised money from Chinese and Korean investors, knowing that there's a massive market for films in Asia. Now she's focused on NFTs and Web3. It's early, but blockchain can potentially automate how artists are paid and be protected. If you had a different favorite Inspired Money moment, please let me know by sharing a comment or going to the Inspired Money Makers Facebook group at inspiredmoney.fm/Facebook. Thanks for tuning in to the end. Be sure to subscribe to my email that goes out every 2 weeks. It's investment focused, and the Runnymede investment team highlights data, news, and events that we think are worth sharing. Subscribe at inspiredmoney.fm/newsletter. It's free and informative. Thank you for joining me on this mission. Have an inspired week and do something that scares you, because that's where the magic happens.